We touch on two topics this week on a Relatable Journey. One, following God's word when it comes to your career, and also something we all struggle with, forgiveness. Jason Romano had to learn to forgive his dad, and then he wrote a book about forgiving his dad. Here's his story.
You really never know if it's God's voice and God's plan until you take that step and then you look back. Sometimes though, when God calls us to step out, it won't make sense. But I'm going to be intentional about building relationships with different people and see what kind of doors God might open up. I really didn't have many memories of my mom and dad being together. I still loved my dad, but I had to kind of create barriers. My dad's at his lowest point, and I get a call, and it's from a nurse at a hospital.
Thanks for joining us here on a Relatable Journey. And what's crazy is we actually have a little bit of a history with each other. We've worked with each other at ESPN. We didn't cross paths often, but it's crazy that we're now here together. How about that?
It's awesome. I love when the Lord works his magic and takes us on that straight path that he describes. And both of our paths, I'm sure, have been anything but straight. But yeah, man, it's good to cross paths with you again. And I do remember our time at ESPN. It was a lot of fun.
Now, I don't want anyone to get confused. That Emmy behind you, you earned that. I had nothing to do with any sort of Emmy. You were way above me. I was at the bottom of the totem pole, and you were doing some really cool stuff there. I mean, you were working with Chris Berman, Tom Jackson. You were on the biggest shows of the biggest shows, living your dream. And then to kind of get into this, God said, all right, it's time to go. It's time to leave ESPN. And you kind of worked your whole life to get there. So how did that all pan out?
Well, it's funny because as a kid growing up, you know, I'm just like most kids who love sports, that was my God, that was my life, my identity, if you want to even call it that, was sports. So that's what I desired to do when I went to high school and realized I wasn't going to be a professional athlete, Will, like we all desire to, right? And I realized, this isn't going to work out for me to be a pro athlete or even a college athlete for that matter. The next best thing was to figure out how I could still work in sports, and broadcasting was always appealing to me. And then I decided, wait, there's colleges that offer programs in broadcasting. I think I want to do that. And so that's what I did my first couple of years in college, and then went to a 4-year school, went to a 2-year school, combined it, got my degrees, and got out of school and just had this desire to work in this business. And initially I worked in radio for a couple years, and, you know, that was a lot of fun. It was local radio. It was in the town that I grew up in, Albany, New York. And again, tons of fun, but it wasn't sports. It was news talk radio. And we were covering, you know, local politics and, you know, the big news of the day, some of it, which was like, you know, a cat getting stuck in the tree or something, you know, so small and minuscule, but for local news, you cover it, right? And then an opportunity to go to ESPN came 20 years ago, actually, in 2000, almost 21 years ago now. And that was the dream, right? When you think about it. In fact, I tell people, Will, maybe you say this too, I didn't dream big enough to end up at ESPN. My dream would have been to be the local sports announcer on Channel 13 in Albany, New York. Like that would have been the dream. That was the dream. But the opportunity to go to ESPN came. Long story short, we can get into it if you want, but I got the job, started in radio, worked on Mike and Mike in its infancy days in the summer of 2000, and 17 years later, you know, walked away, which is kind of crazy when you think
it's
about it.
It's funny you say you don't know if you dreamed big enough. That's my biggest fear, if you will, is that I don't dream big enough so I kind of just leave everything open. Like God's going to put me where he's going to put me. He's going to take me where he's going to take me. As long as it's up to him, as long as he's guiding me and I take my hands off the wheel, which I'm sure you did early in your career, which I did. I tried to steer where I was going to go. And I'll say, I'll never go to Fargo. I went to Fargo. I'm never going to go to Toledo or Wichita. Well, I ended up all these places. When I saw him on the list board of, you know, jobs available, I was like, there's no way I'm going there. Well, I went all there and I took my hands off the wheel. So now my biggest fear is just don't limit yourself. Don't limit God, because he can do a lot more than you can even dream of.
Absolutely. There's no doubt. And it's funny, early on, you know, during those times when I first started working at ESPN, my faith wasn't an important thing to my life at all. I mean, I didn't even have a relationship with God or even care about matters of faith. That didn't happen for a year or two later. So yeah, I was in the driver's seat. And let me just say this too, and we can talk if you want about my faith journey, but even after becoming a Christian or starting a relationship with the Lord, I kept my hands on the wheel many, many times, trying to control it myself. And you're right. Every single time that I've tried to do that, it usually ended up falling, flat on my face. And every time I took the hand off the wheel and let God guide it as He should, that's when doors started opening up that I couldn't have dreamed about. And even doors opening up to eventually leave ESPN.
That's how I was when I was younger, for sure. When I was at ESPN, I believed in God. I definitely didn't have the relationship with Him that I have today.
Yeah.
And we talked to your buddy, Daryl Strawberry, already here on a Relatable Journey. And he said he wanted God to be his co-pilot early in the relationship. Like, hey, you sit there and I'll call on you when I need you.
Yes.
But until then, I want to do this my way. But your faith journey at ESPN was interesting because I heard you tell a story that Tony Dungy looked at you in the green room outside of the DC Center one time and said, "Hey, what are you doing here at work with your Christian, with being a Christian, with your faith?" And you were like, "I don't know."
Yeah, holy cow! And it's funny because by that point, I had probably see. There's a point when you start, right? The starting point where you say, "Yes, I'm going to start this relationship with the Lord," right? And that happened for me in 2001 on Mother's Day of all days. But it wasn't until that day with Coach Dungy in 2010. So we're 9 years later now, right? And he asks me a question that changed my life. And the exact phrasing of the question was, how are you living your faith out here in the workplace at ESPN? And, Coach Dungy, I had not known him prior, but he had a lot of people in his circles that I was, friends with or had a relationship with. So he found out or knew by someone that I was a Christian pretty quickly that day. And so we're having a conversation in the green room, right? You remember where the green room was, right across from DC, the digital center in DC1. Yeah, it wasn't even a green room, right? It was just a
closet.
Yeah, it was a closet pretty much. But Coach Dungy's in there, his assistant Jessica is in there, his publicist is in there, and I'm in there. And Coach Dungy didn't have to take an interest in me. He could have easily just said, where are we going next? What's it like to work at ESPN? But again, he found out I was a Christian. He went there. How do you live your faith out in the workplace at ESPN? And I said to him, I thought about it for a second and I'm like, I'm not even sure if I can do that working at ESPN, just being honest. Like I said, I am a Christian. I love Jesus and I'm go to church on Sundays. I'm in a, a life group or a home group and I read my Bible sometimes. I'm not going to lie and say I read it every day at that point, but it's interesting when I think back because I really didn't understand how you can live your faith out in the workplace. I just thought it's ESPN. There's no way I can do this. And before he could even get a word in, and he's looking at me like a disappointed dad, his assistant Jessica comes in and she takes the role of disappointed mom. And she comes in, steps in, looks at me, puts her hands on her hips, shakes her head and says, "You don't get it, do you?" And I said, "Jessica," and I had known Jessica decently well enough on a couple projects previously that I felt, that she had the permission to just, even if she didn't, I wouldn't have cared, but she jumped in and had this boldness about her. And she's like, "You don't get it. You don't get what Coach Dungy's trying to say here." And I said, "Well, help me out here. What don't I get?" And she said, "Look at where you work." And you've been there, Will. Look at where you work. There's 3,000 people walking the campus every single day. Look at how much of an influence you can be, a positive light, a light in the darkness, if you will, to all of these people. What a ministry that you have working at ESPN. I thought, ministry? This is not a ministry. This is my job. But then I realized as she's saying this, she says the most important phrase, maybe it probably should have been the title of the book, is until God calls you away. Because I told her, I think the only way I could do this is if I worked at, in a sports ministry, which I am now. But at the time, I thought that was the only way you could be a Christian in the workplace. She said, until you're called away, you are to bloom where you're planted. And if God's planted you right here at ESPN, this is where you need to be a Christian. And this is where you need to be walking, as an ambassador, if you will, like it says in 2 Corinthians, an ambassador of Christ. And that doesn't mean I'm walking around with a Bible in my hand and, a cross on my shirt every day, Will. You know what would have happened there. We both would have gotten fired very quickly if we tried to do that. But it just meant how you treat people, how you live your life, being bold, standing up for what you believe in, never forcing your faith on anyone, but being a light and allowing for people to see that light and potentially open up doors to have conversations about the Lord. And I got it. It was like a light bulb just got really bright above my head when Jessica said that. And I tell people that question from Coach Dungy, that answer from Jessica, changed my life because it allowed me to go to work every day with a different purpose from that day forward.
So with all of that in mind, with all of that in your head as the foundation to the viewer and listener right now, you finally get to ESPN, you're interacting with people like Tony Dungy, and then God says, this isn't it. You got to leave here. You got to take a 40% pay cut and you got to go somewhere else. And you're like, wait, who, me? Like, he's talking to me?
Yeah, that's how I felt like. I'm looking in the mirror and saying, God, this isn't me you're talking about, right? And that's not your voice, is it?
How difficult is that?
Yeah.
Like to make that transition? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people in their career journey that are trying to trust God. And he's like, you need to do this right now for me and be a servant.
Yeah. And it's interesting you use the words right now, because the first time I thought I was supposed to leave ESPN was 2015. And I didn't leave until 2017. So you can see this was a process. This wasn't like God speaking in one ear at the 1 o'clock mark. And by 2 o'clock, I was goodbye. I was out. It wasn't that way at all. It was definitely crock pottish, not microwavable, if you will.
On low simmer.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I think there's a real important lesson here for those listening to, understand a couple things. First, when you feel like God is speaking to you, it's important to seek wise counsel, to seek God's word, to pray, obviously, and to make sure it's God's voice, because we can get that mixed up as human beings and thinking that it's our voice or thinking that it's God's voice when it's our voice. You know what I mean?
Funny. Rick Warren touches on that. He says something that's really funny. He says, I could have bad enchilada the night before, and if I'm trusting my gut, I'm going to do something really stupid.
Exactly. That's an amazing quote, by the way. But that's what it was. And I remember exactly where I was when I first had this inkling that maybe God was calling me away. And it was in Nashville, Tennessee. I was working, ironically, on social media at this point on the NFL project and the MLB project, the Major League Baseball project. It was a great job, and I really loved what I was doing. And I was invited to speak at this Christian social media conference. Everybody there worked for a Christian organization, a church, a nonprofit, doing what I was doing at ESPN, social media. I was the only person who worked for a secular organization, if you call it that, at this conference. And they asked me to speak and share a little bit about what life was like as a social media manager at that time. But in my soul, I saw God doing something. He was opening up my eyes to see that there were people doing the exact same work I was doing, but for what I deemed as a greater purpose, right? And so I'm seeing them and I'm like, these people are in churches and nonprofits and different places, learning and teaching and applying the same skills that I have at ESPN. Maybe someday I could do that. I could take what I had from ESPN and apply it into ministry for a greater purpose. And again, it was just this maybe kind of thought that was in my brain, but it really sunk in to the point where I explored this the next year and a half. And I was like, all right, I don't know what this looks like. I don't know where I would even go, but I'm going to be intentional about building relationships with different people and see what kind of doors God might open up. And lo and behold, as I was trying to leave ESPN, I think in the end of 2015, thinking this is it, I'm out of here, I get a promotion and an opportunity to go back to work on Mike and Mike in the Morning in 2016. And by that time, you were kind of in the middle there, Will, with that show, and it was getting pretty big. By 2016, this was a monster. I mean, it had 30 people working on the show between television and radio and
I think
social
we had
media.
2 or 3 people on TV when I was there.
Right. It wasn't that case in 2016.
Yeah, wow.
And they had really built this thing up to be, a giant at ESPN. And to go back and work on that show, I thought this would be a real neat opportunity. But I really, in the back of my mind, even though it was the best year of my career at ESPN, was my last year, I still thought God was calling me away. And it wasn't until the end of 2016 when this door opened up to go work for Sports Spectrum. You mentioned 40% pay cut. You mentioned, leaving for what was a much different position in terms of, it was a contract job. There were no benefits. It was 1 year. It was just, there was a lot of uncertainty with this role. But I just, after, really seeking some wise counsel, my brother, obviously my wife, and praying about it, I was like, I think this is the time. This is the door. And I say this all the time, Will, to people now. You really never know if it's God's voice and God's plan until you take that step and then you look back, right? Because initially you're taking the step and you're thinking it's God's plan, but you don't know 100% for sure that this is exactly where he wants you to go until you do it and you see. And I told my wife, I said, listen, when I leave, if we leave, if this is from God, the door will swing wide open and he'll take care of all this. He'll provide. And if it's not, it'll shut really fast in my face and it'll be time for the next move, or let's go back to ESPN, because I still live here in Bristol, Connecticut. I haven't moved yet. I say yet, it'll happen someday, but we're still here. My daughter's in high school, but it's not until really even now, 4 years later, that I can tell you, Will, looking back, it was clearly the Lord's plan, because doors opened up that I could never have imagined, and opportunities even like this to talk to you. Like, those are not things that I was expecting to happen. I was just trying to follow, the Lord's plan and his voice and be obedient. And again, if it's not my plan, then it would have blown up. I really believe, or if it is my plan, it would have blown up. But if it's God's plan, it's not going to. He's going to see it through.
I'm engaged right now, so a lot of things you're saying, it was so important for me to find a person and a woman that had a faith like I did, so that we can run and chase Jesus together. And
yeah,
I said to her early on, I said, if anything ever happened, my biggest fear is that we wouldn't get down on our knees and just pray and ask for help. And she looked, because she didn't have a strong faith when we met. And God spoke to me and said, listen, this is the woman for you. Don't you worry about taking care of this. I've got this. So he answered some of my prayers. I mean, like, bluntly in my face. I was like, all right, fine, I'll trust you. Now we're getting married. It's the perfect person. So how much does having someone that's listening, having a partner in life to chase God with, so that you can say, hey, no, God's telling me to go here and take a 40% cut. So she understands that, versus, all right, you nut job, this isn't happening.
Right. Well, believe me, there was those responses too initially, but it was a year earlier when she didn't call me a nut job, but I'm sure she would have if that word came to her mind, because it didn't make sense. Right. Mm-hmm. And sometimes though, when God calls us to step out, it won't make sense to the world. Right. And I remember, there were people that came up to me and said, are you sure you're going to do this? 17 years at ESPN, you got a lot invested. Are you sure this is the time? And I said, honestly, I'm not. I said, but I have to do this now, because I do believe it's from God. And if I don't, and if I stay here till I'm 60 or whatever, I might regret this moment right now. And I said, I need to do this, mostly because God is telling me to. But you asked the question about the importance of having a partner. It's extremely important to be like-minded, to be equally yoked, as the word says. I mean, I'll be completely honest with you. My wife and I, when we got married, we were both Catholic, but we were very nominal Catholic. Like, we weren't going to church together every Sunday. I would say our beliefs were aligned at that time when we got married, but they were very nominal beliefs, believe in God, be a good person, basic kind of worldly things that I had thought about. But then I got saved and became a Christian, a real follower of Christ, I should say, in May of 2001. My wife didn't come to faith until probably February or March of 2005. Wow. So there was a 4-year period there of us not agreeing on everything. And we were already married. So I'm in this with her, right? As husband and wife. And at the same time, we're not seeing eye to eye on a lot of things. We're not arguing over it.
The most important thing too.
But the most important thing, right? And I think she initially said to me, why do you, because my brother is the one who led me to the Lord. My brother had this like real 180-degree conversion from where he was. So my wife's like, he needed that, but you're fine. Like, you and I are fine. You work at ESPN. We have a good job. We have a house. We're fine. And she was, in essence, from a worldly perspective, she was right. I was fine, but underneath there was so much going on. There's so much junk, and I wasn't fine. And I think eventually after I pulled back and didn't force her to believe what I believed, I just loved her. She made some relationships with some friends from the church we went to, and that led her to coming to church. And I think understanding that actually we're all not fine without Christ. We're actually all messed up. And it's not that, we're inherently good people. We're actually inherently bad people without the Lord, because that sin nature is just in all of us. And so she begins this walk. And I'm telling you, from that moment, it just allowed us to see things more clearly together. And, certainly having a daughter at that point, Sarah, I think was a year old, being able to raise her together equally in the same, in knowing that we were going to raise her Christian and raise her to love Jesus. I'm so glad that God allowed that to happen, because I don't know what would have happened if she saw things differently than I did in our marriage, certainly in how we raised our daughter. So yeah, it's vitally important that you try to find someone who is like-minded with you on that, because that will cause, or that will push pause, I should say, on a lot of problems that could eventually come down the road.
So you said, quote, so much junk, and this kind of steers me into, I wonder if you ever would have forgiven your father. And when I read up and learned about this, if you didn't leave ESPN, if you didn't follow, would that all have happened? Because tell that story and because it's remarkable, and it almost, it might be easier for me to kind of hear about your story and look at it from an aerial 30,000 feet view and say, wow, it's crazy to see how these dots have connected for you.
Well, I will preface in saying I was a Christian for 10 years before I was able to forgive my dad. So becoming a Christian didn't just automatically, change who I was in terms of forgiving my father, the story of forgiving my father. So I grew up with parents who were divorced at 6 years old. So I grew up in a broken home, 5 years old, actually. So I really didn't have many memories of my mom and dad being together, right? So right there, you're already kind of put your back against the wall. And in the time that I did spend with my dad, it was usually on the weekends, and it usually involved sports. We would watch the games together, and especially football during the fall. And, he loved sports. It's what led me to love sports. But as a young kid, he would take me to the bar and we would watch games at the bar, but then he would give me a quarter, buy me a soda, and tell me to go play pinball or video games. So I'm kind of blinded on the fact of what's really going on with my father while I'm doing this. He's getting drunk, and that's how he coped. And he, in essence, became an alcoholic and really struggled for many, many years with alcohol. And I didn't understand it at 7, 8, or 9. I really started to understand it at 13, 14, and even more when I got to high school, and certainly when I was older. So it was a very confusing relationship, a broken relationship, a relationship that, like I said, should have brought us together with sports. Unfortunately, sports is what actually ended up tearing us apart too, because he would always drink when there was sports on. He would always get very verbally abusive and loud and say things that he would never say if he didn't have alcohol on him. He was never physically abusive or violent in that sense. He might throw things around the house, but he would never hit us or anything like that. But he was a monster in a lot of ways from a verbal perspective. And as I got older, I started to create these barriers. I still loved my dad, but I had to kind of create barriers in my life to keep me to allow myself to experience life without him, and for many years I did that. I mean, we would always talk on the phone, but we very rarely saw each other, maybe once or twice a year. And even in those moments, sometimes he would be drinking, I could tell. And it was just a really tough relationship, Will, in for my teen years, when he missed my high school graduation, early 20s, he missed college graduation, getting into 1999 when I got married to my wife, and even in the early 2000s when my daughter was born. My dad was drinking and either in a rehab center or just not in a good state, and missed all of those, what I call pillar or pivotal moments in a young man's life. Right. And you want your dad at these things because he's your guy. You want your support system to be there and your family. And my dad wasn't at any of those moments. So I've harbored up at this point, I was 30 when my daughter was born. I had harbored up a lot of bitterness and resentment towards my father. Right. And so we get into the 30s, at this time I'm at ESPN and I'm still doing my thing there. And everything's fine on the surface. And even my relationship with God is starting to develop and things are going well. But underneath, there was still this bitterness and anger that I always carried around with me and harbored towards my dad. Just get better. Just stop drinking. Stop calling me when you're drunk. Stop calling us these names, and everything would be fine in our relationship. And he couldn't do it. Now, I never had any empathy toward my dad in those days. I didn't see anything from his perspective. I really was being selfish when I look back at it, because it was just about how it affected me. Now, did I deserve to have a dad who was treating me like this? No, but I never understood or really cared to understand what he was going through. So fast forward, it's 2012, 2013, and he's pretty much at this point in a really bad state. I would say he's just about 63 years old, 62 at that time, and he can't kick it. And at this point, we're into his, he'd been divorced twice. He had lost his teaching job. He had been out of teaching for 20 years because of the alcohol. He showed up drunk at work one day, and that was the end of that. And he's living on disability, in retirement and all these other things that, he can live on, and just in a really bad state. He had also developed at this point, Will, a mental illness. Like he was struggling with depression. So when you compound depression and alcoholism, it's a pretty bad combination. And my dad was going through it. Let's put it that way. And at this point, I'm almost 40 years old, and I've kind of moved on. Like my relationship with my dad, it was very, very, it was hanging on by a thread, right? I loved him. I really did. I wanted him to get better. I prayed for him every so often. And my prayer for him was always just for him to get sober. I think back now, I wished I was praying for him to come to know Christ, but that wasn't my prayer. My prayer was just that he would get sober, and then everything else would figure itself out. And 2013 comes, and my dad's at his lowest point, and I get a call, and it's from a nurse at a hospital. And she says, "Mr. Romano, your father is in the hospital right now. He tried to end his life last night, and he's here. He's not going to die. He's going to make it. But I wanted you to know this was in Albany, New York, where he lives, and I'm here in Connecticut. They said, if you want to drive out and come see him, you can. He's in the psych ward at Albany Medical Center." And this is how bitter I was, Will, at this point, and how numb I was to my father. I just felt nothing when that nurse called. I said, "Thank you very much for letting me know." That was it. And then I hung up the phone. And I remember telling my wife, even telling my pastor and a few others what had happened. And they were like, "Well, how do you feel?" I'm like, and I hate admitting this because it's really true what I was thinking. I said, it probably would have been better if he just didn't make it, because it would take away his pain. It would have taken away all the problems that we have as a family. That's obviously not true, but that's where my mindset was. Like he was at just his lowest point. And a week later, he called me from the hospital. And that was our way of communicating, was just phone calls. It still is, really, when I think about it today. And he said, he just said, "Hey, Jay." And I could tell in his voice, all he had to say was, "Hello, Jay." And I heard this empty soul, like there was no life in him. He was just done. You could tell, but he was still fighting, but he was done. Like you could hear it in his voice. He had nothing to offer. And I'm not even sure why he called. And before he could even say anything else, I stopped him and I said, "Dad, thank you for calling. I'm so sorry for what you're going through. And I want you to know that whatever's happened in the past is in the past." I said, "I forgive you, and let's just move forward. I hope you get better." And that was the first time, Will, that I ever saw my dad how Christ saw him. I saw a man who was broken and hurting, and all that junk that I just described. My dad had that junk. I had that junk.
It's
My
almost
dad
like
has
we all
sin.
do.
It's we all do, right? And so my dad has issues. I have issues. Jesus looks at all of us the same. And he says, "I want you. I want you. I want you. You're my child. I love you." And for so many years, I looked at my dad in a much different light. I looked at him as all the failures that he had accomplished, and all the failures that he had, had to live through. And I saw a broken man, and I said, "This guy is not as good as I am." Right? I'm up here working at ESPN and married with a kid, and things are going great. And he's down here, low, messed up, broken, 2 divorces, lost his job, nowhere to turn. That's how I looked at him for so many years. And I had this anger. But then when I talked to him and all I had to do was hear 2 words come out of his mouth, and I said, this is a broken man who simply needs someone to know that he matters, you know? And I don't know why at that moment I chose to say, I forgive you. Now I'll say this, Will, it didn't just become like, it goes back to that instantaneous thing, right? It wasn't something that just ended right there. Like this is a process that's now almost 9 years in the making that I still, or 8 years in the making that I still work through every day. But I'm happy to report that that last day when my dad tried to end his life, that's the last time he's had a drink of alcohol.
Wow. Good.
In 8 years. And it's pretty crazy to even say that out loud still, because I never thought we'd see the day that my dad would be sober. And I'm talking about sober for a long time. Like he had moments where he was sober for a couple months or whatever. This is a guy now going on almost 8 years of sobriety, and he's turned his life around. He's still working on his relationship with the Lord. I would say it's not there quite yet. And I wish that's what I could tell everybody. Like Jesus came and saved him and this man is on fire. That's simply not the case. But remember my prayer. My prayer was for him to get sober, and he's sober, and God answered that prayer. And now my next prayer is, as people are listening, to pray for his salvation, because that's something we're still working on. But, you know, God has done an absolute miracle in his life. Our relationship is reconciled. We're not where I would like to be, you know, in terms of the perfect father-son relationship, but I don't think we'll ever have that. But man, we're not where we used to be. And that gives me hope. That gives me peace, and that brings me joy. And I don't have that burden anymore. I don't have that bitterness towards him anymore. I just don't.
And the coolest thing with all that, now that the viewer and listener knows, is that you actually, and I say that with a smile on my face, had the nerve to want to put this in a book for everybody to see about your dad.
I didn't want to, Will.
You went and asked him, and his answer I thought was the coolest answer that could have been said.
When I went to him with this idea, and this idea really didn't come from me. I mean, you know me, I'm a producer guy. I'm a broadcaster guy. You know, now I'm hosting shows, and my desire is not to write a book. I do not enjoy writing. So that was not like on the bucket list. Let me write a book someday about my broken relationship with my father. It'll be a bestseller, and God will do amazing.
Dream, right?
No way, no how was I going to do that. But somebody heard me speak at my church and first approached me about 5 years ago and said, you know what you just told me about your father? It was the first time I've ever shared publicly about my dad. Very similar to what I just shared with you. And I really took a deep dive into forgiveness in the Bible, and we can talk about that if you want. But he heard this sermon and said to me, you need to write a book. And I said, you're crazy. I'm not writing any book. He's like, no, if you can help someone, you need to write it. And I said, well, how do you do that? And so I called a couple author friends of mine, and they showed me, you know, how they kind of went about their process. But the conversation with my father had to take place first before I even approached this idea. Because I said, Dad, this idea about writing a book about our relationship came, and it would be about forgiveness. That's the ultimate overlying topic. I said, but if I write this story, I need to be as blunt, as honest, as real, as raw as I can be in writing this book. And unfortunately, you're going to be painted as the villain. Like, you're going to be the bad guy for a good majority of this book. And my dad's a pretty private guy. Like, he doesn't have the internet. He's never been on the internet. This is my dad, right? He still reads newspapers and talks on the phone. He's got a cell phone, but it's a flip phone. And he has no email. I mean, he doesn't know anything about social media or anything like that. So my dad is a very simple man, and he's a private man. And I said,
nice.
I'm going to be writing a book about us, and it's going to be read by how many, whatever, one person, but hopefully more. Are you okay with this? And he said, Jay, I probably would have said no initially, but I am so okay with this because I know that you already shared our story at your church. And if it can help one person, you need to write it. If it can help one person, you need to write it. And I would say if it can help one person, you need to tell it. If it can help one person, you need to say it. Like, that just transcends book writing. That's something that everybody who's listening and watching can take into their life. If you know that you can help someone else and you don't do it, you're basically putting a hand to the face of God here, right? And so my dad, of all people, saying, you need to write this, was the catalyst that I took the next steps. Then, of course, I talked to my brothers and my mom and my wife. And once they all got on board, that's when Live to Forgive really took shape, and it released in 2018. Yeah, it's crazy.
To anybody that's watching and listening, what's the one prayer that you suggest they pray if they need to forgive somebody right now?
If the people listening, the prayer that would probably indicate to me that they're a Christian. So the first thing I would say is, before you even pray, like, seek scripture, because scripture is very clear that we have to forgive every single time that we're wronged. And that's a hard thing to do, but that's what scripture says. And if we're followers of Christ, we need to follow and that's what Jesus says. It's not just what scripture says. It's in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18. Go read the parable of the unforgiving debtor, and you will see how serious Jesus is about forgiving. So the prayer I would encourage people to pray is simply to, Lord, forgive me. That's the first prayer. And then help me to forgive those that have wronged me. It really goes back to the Lord's Prayer. When you read the Lord's Prayer in I think it's Matthew, in Matthew 7, Jesus talks about saying, here's how you should pray. Our Father who art in heaven, you know the prayer, right? But forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Like, that's Jesus saying, this is how you need to pray. So I would say, if you're asking me for a prayer, well, let's look at the prayer that Jesus told us to pray, which is asking for forgiveness every day from him, because again, we are broken. And then saying, Lord, help us forgive those that have hurt us, forgive those that have sinned against us or trespassed against us.
You have such an awesome journey, such a great story. I think you've been such a blessing to so many people that have listened and watched this. What's the one thing you want them to take away, though, from your journey?
When I think about that question, it's, my journey was anything but straight in my eyes. I am where I am now, and I'm certainly didn't dream about being where I am now. If we go back 5 years ago and you and I so we crossed paths at ESPN, or 6 years ago, and you told me where I was today, I mean, you probably say the same thing, and that I would be on your show doing a an interview. We both would have laughed at each other, right? But the verse in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, it's one of my life verses, where it says, trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Now that path, from my perspective, is anything but straight. But when I've put my true faith in God and I've followed him and I've given my life to him, wherever God takes me, that's his straight path. It might be a very windy path in my eyes and in the world that I live in. I'm sure you could say the same thing, but it's perfectly straight if we're in his will, right? We're in the will of God. And that's what I would encourage people on. Listen, take chances, dream big, of course, trust God, like really trust him. And if he pulls you into something that's a little uncomfortable, know that that's actually a really good thing. Like, me leaving ESPN was so uncomfortable. It really was. It was the unknown. It was the unseen. But when you're in the perfect will of God, he will direct your path. That's what he says. And so my encouragement would be to just trust in him, take those steps, seek him first, as it says in Matthew 6, and really just dig deep into him, like chase after him, pursue him, and he'll take care of you. Like, he'll take you to places actually that you probably never even thought you'd be ending up in. So that would be my encouragement.
I couldn't agree more. You can't dream big enough, because you can't dream bigger than God.
That's right.
And miracles can't happen when everything you think is going well. He needs your attention. You got to know, you don't know how much you need God until God is all you have. That's when miracles happen. So I think that's absolutely perfect. And man, you summed it up perfectly, Jason. I appreciate you coming on a Relatable Journey, buddy.
Thanks, Will. Good to see you. Good to talk to you. Good to reconnect with you. And thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on a Relatable Journey today. Now we need your help. We want to get this in front of as many people as possible. In order to do that, we got to please the algorithms on all these platforms. This is how it works. You got to follow or subscribe on your platform, and then leave a 5-star rating and write a review. I know it can be a lot, but please help us out with this. Because of you, this is a Relatable Journey.